Hello, this is Tony Blazer back with another video for the Motocross Vault here on YouTube. And for this one, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to take some of these, one of these classic magazines I have from behind me. In this case, it's going to be the 1989 October issue of Motocross Action. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through it page by page, similar to what I did a few months back with Inside Motocross. Go through, kind of talk about the magazine, talk about the ads, or whatever else kind of strikes me as we go through it. As you can see, I have quite a few of these magazines. 89 is one of my favorite years for motocross action, and motocross in general. It was a real big transition year there. It's kind of the passing of the guard with Rick Johnson being hurt mid-season, and then Jeff Ward being hurt at the start of the season. Kind of left the door open for Jeff Stanton to assert himself, and he would kind of be the man for the next 2 or 3 years before before McGrath really took the bull by the horns in '93 and kind of started his own reign of domination. '89 is a great year. This issue here actually covers a lot of the new bikes for '90. As you know, 1990 is also one of my favorite years for motorcycles. I had all 3 Honda CRs that year. A buddy of mine had an RM. It actually currently has a KX2, restoring it, and just a lot of cool bikes that year. So I thought this would be a good one to start out our adventure with. So I hope you like it. If so, be sure to subscribe, hit the little bell to get notified when we get a new video up. I'm going to try and put out one, hopefully every couple of weeks. We'll see. These are sometimes time consuming, so we'll have to see how it goes. But in any case, if you like it, let me know, and we'll see if we can do some more. Here we go. All right, we're going to start here with the cover of the October issue of Motocross Action here in 1989. On the cover, we have Larry Brooks, who was a national pro at the time and also motocross action test rider. Larry he might have the record for the most all-time covers for MXA. I'm not sure, but he was certainly on a lot of them. Here he's on the new 1990 YZ, probably a 250 most likely, but it's hard to tell because of the roost there. This issue is pretty interesting. It's definitely one of my favorite issues back then. It covers all the new bikes. Back before the internet, you really didn't see much, if anything, about the new bikes before they were released. And I coveted that new model issue every year. So this is one of my favorites, and this is one of the reasons I went with this one is the first one we'll do. All right, here on the inside cover, we have an ad for Fox Racing. Fox was definitely on fire in 1989. They were. This is just after the release of the zebra print gear. They were really going crazy with some wild prints. They had. Unfortunately, Rick Johnson had just left for JT Racing, but they still had a great stable of young riders. Pretty much all of them are shown here in this ad. You have Jeff Matasevich, Damon Bradshaw, Donnie Schmidt, who was on a privateer Honda this year after losing his Suzuki ride, Ronnie Titchener, who was on factory Suzuki, Larry Ward, who was on a kind of a backdoor factory Honda ride. Definitely a great team, awesome gear this year, good-looking stuff all around, and a pretty cool ad. On the next couple of pages, we have another ad for Fox Racing. This one's covering the beautiful Fox Roost 2, which is my all-time favorite chest protector in terms of looks. Kidney belts, which were still a thing in the 90s. Definitely one of the more popular items Fox produced at the time. Elbow guards, which I literally never saw anybody wear or had any myself. Probably a good idea, but the biofoam stuff, it looked a little goofy. And then water paws, which I was never into watercraft or anything, but I'm sure there's a lot of guys running around with jet skis who had these. Fox Racing, like I said, was producing some really cool stuff at this time, and you can see how successful they are. They're in a lot of these motocross actions and stuff back at this time. All right, here on the table of contents page, we have an ad for Sidewinder sprockets. At the time, Sidewinder sprockets and chains were probably the most high-profile provider of sprocket and chains in the motocross industry. They were really popular there for a while. The company was founded by Vic Krause, the guy behind Mr. Know-It-All's column on Dirt Bike Magazine, and they produced some really good stuff. I think they kind of got pushed out of the limelight by companies like Renthal when Axo Sport started promoting Renthal. They really kind of took some of the mind share of Sidewinder. They were promoting their factory Honda teams, and you didn't see anybody on a motocross level, at least, running Sidewinder stuff. They did have some pretty innovative things, though. They had like a sprocket you could take apart in 2 pieces to switch the gearing without taking the wheel off. Unfortunately, I think they had some reliability issues with that. It was kind of neat. It kind of worked like a little puzzle. Overall, though, I don't think that one caught on. Really, once companies like Renthal and Answer and some of the other vehicle or gear companies started getting in more into hard part stuff and really marketing them in the 90s, it kind of pushed Sidewinder out of the limelight. I got to be honest, I don't even know if they still exist now. I assume they probably do. I don't imagine Vic Krause is still running them, but so I wonder, like I said, was a big deal in the late 80s and early 90s. On the table of contents page itself, we have a picture of the reigning 250 world champion, which was Dutch rider John Vandenberg. John was coming off his second world title. He had run one in the 125 class as well. And this picture was from the U.S. Grand Prix that year at Unadilla. On pages 8 and 9 here, we have an ad for the new YZ125 and YZ250 for 1990. I had the 88 YZ250 when it came out with the new body. Loved it. It was a cool bike. And then in 89, I had the 89 YZ125. I didn't have any of these 90s. I didn't really care for the looks of the 90 that much. It's kind of funny they added really only a couple of little things to set it apart from the 89, which I thought was a really good looking bike. I guess it's not fair to say I didn't like this. I didn't think it was very much of a difference. I didn't really care for the red anodized forks. The upside down forks, this is the second year for the upside down forks on the YZs, and this year they anodized them red. That was kind of a thing that was in the early 90s there. Kawasaki did the same thing with theirs, making them blue. In any case, the 90 wasn't much different. It was kind of a subtle refresh. The 250 did get some new, subtly changed bodywork. The tank was different. The shroud was no longer asymmetrical. It had the same design on both sides. But really, other than red fork, I was about to say fork boots, but not fork boots. Rather than red forks and some little stripes on the seat, kind of a ode to the strobe you'd see years later. They really visually don't look much different. This ad as well is not very exciting to me. Yamaha would have some of the best ads in the 90s. They had a phenomenal run of really interesting ads throughout the 90s. This is definitely not one of them, in my opinion. Not their best design. On page 10, we have a column by Roland Hines, who was the president and publisher of High Torque Publications at the time. I've always heard a rumor that Roland didn't actually write these, that they were written by Jody, but I have no idea if that's true or not. Obviously, I have never spoken to Jody or Roland about this, but it's one of those things you hear. This is a really interesting column because it's takes place, actually, the issue says it's October, but this was probably written, I don't know, probably in July or August or something. It's a several-month lead time. And at the time, this article is talking about the Motocross des Nations and our team for '89. Roland's talking about the history of the team and how we had done okay in the early '70s, kind of gave up on it, and then came back in the '80s and were dominating it. And for '89, we had picked a team of Jeff Stanton, Jeff Ward, and Rick Johnson. Now, I have to admit, I don't remember this because I only remember the team that actually went. Rick Johnson actually didn't go that year. He was coming off his wrist injury. I imagine when they had to pick a team, he had just maybe ridden at Mammoth Mountain, may not have even ridden any nationals. He had dominated the early part of the year, winning the first 5 Supercrosses, but then had his arm broken, his wrist broken at Gainesville. So like I said, he may not have even ridden but maybe 1 or 2 races when they picked the team by midsummer. So RJ was kind of maybe a hope and a prayer. I imagine he probably backed out after he's having issues with his wrist. They also talk about the issue of who's going to ride the 125. That's one of those hot buttons thing today. We talk about where we don't put our best guys necessarily out there. You wouldn't see Tomac out there on a 250 probably. But at the time, a lot of our guys would step down. In '88, Jeff Ward had stepped down to ride the 125. And there was speculation that either Rick Johnson would do it or maybe Jeff Stanton. Kind of in preparation, Jeff Stanton had ridden the 125 at Unadilla that year and it just smoked everybody on it. Jeff was known as a big bike rider, a 500 rider primarily, but it was pretty clear he could go pretty fast on a 125. The alternate, is, Roland says here, is Ron Lachine, but of course he would break his femur that year in the 500 Nationals, so he was out. So it probably made sense to put Kedrowski on there. He was the guy who ended up winning the 125 title that year. So as history would show, in West Germany, the team of Ward, Stanton, and Kedrowski pretty much kicked ass. Rode really well on like a freeway, essentially. If you ever see any footage of that track, it's really, really fast and wide open, which is kind of interesting. You see now that our guys seem to have so much trouble adapting to the European-style tracks, but back then they were every bit as different as they are now in terms of what we ride here, maybe more so. Some of those early '90s Motocross des Nations and the '80s ones, if you look at them, the tracks are just like nothing you'd see here. And our guys still went over there and kicked butt. So either that means the Americans are doing poorly or the Europeans are doing better. I don't know, but it is interesting to see just how dominant we were with many different teams, many different riders, and on all kinds of different conditions. On the right here, we have an ad for Scorcher Products. Looks like they're selling gear. I don't remember this company. I can't speak to even if they're still in existence, so I really can't add anything. So maybe we should go to the next slide. On page 12, we have Jody's Box, which is his column. He's been writing since, I don't know, the early 80s probably, since he took over as editor. Um, this is a column that another one I hear rumors of that he reprints old ones of. I got to be honest, I usually don't read this. I kind of skip by it in any of the early magazines, later magazines. I mean, I kind of think that by 1989, I'd read everything you could put in there about Lovely Luella and Jimmy Mack and Crazy Dave, but he continues to do it. This one I did read when I was going back through here to talk about it, and it's he's talking about some crazy guy named Arnold Dittmuller, um, talking about how great he was. That article is it's baffling. I don't even understand what the point of what he's saying is. Kind of one of those head scratchers. Maybe he just had nothing better to say. I don't know. If I had to come up with something new every week to say for 50 years, I'd probably run out of things too. On page 13, we have an ad for Twin Air filters. This one is done by White Brothers, who is obviously another very famous distributor of aftermarket stuff. Twin Air is actually one of the first products that JT Racing started bringing into the country in the early 70s, and one of their first successful products. And Twin Air is definitely still as big today as it was then, maybe more so. Definitely a great filter, and one that a lot of people are still using today. On page 13, I'm sorry, on page 14, we have the dirt section, which is a little has some little tidbits about the sport and such in the issue. And there's some pretty interesting stuff here. In '89, Larry Rossler was like one of the top guys off-road racing. He had been around for quite a while even then, and he was riding the ISDE, and they actually built him a very special KX 125 that year to race with an KX 80 motor. He rode the 80 class, which is just amazing when you're talking about guys like Tomac not wanting to go down to a 250. Rosser actually chose to ride an 80 with a KX 125 chassis. I can't imagine that was a great combination. Ironically, the 80 was probably faster than the 125 year. That 89 KX was a turd, so maybe it actually turned out to be faster. I don't know. Um, Below that, you see there's a really cool, well, I guess cool is a relative word. There's an interesting fork done by AMP Research, which is the guy behind the ATK, Horst Leitner. And they had designed this kind of a weird fork design that has like shocks on it. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Ribby quadrilateral forks that they tested in the early 70s. I have to admit, I've never seen anybody actually run these. I imagine they were heavy and complex and probably not a great idea. One of those things that people try and doesn't work out. You got a picture of Trampus Parker's helmet, KTM man. Uh, at this time, I'd barely heard of Trampus Parker. He was kind of this person that everybody's like, who the hell is this? Who was winning the 125 World Championship at that point. Pretty amazing kind of rags to riches out of nowhere story for the guy. And then it mentions at the bottom Corrado Matti, who was an Italian who was just retiring from professional racing. He had never won a world title, but was a fast guy on the GPs for several years. And then in the main part here, you have who was winning that year. You see a lot of Jeff Matasevich in the 125 Supercross, Rick Johnson and Jeff Stanton in the 250s. On the right, very interesting. This is a Honda Troy ad. At this point, Honda Troy was, completely off my radar. I had only seen them here in these little ads. They didn't have a race team yet for another 2 or 3 years. They were just a mail order place in Central Ohio. Obviously, they did well enough with that to field the team a couple years later, but this was kind of the earliest I remember seeing them in anything. On pages 16 and 17, we have some more great ads. The one at the top left, Magic Racing. Don't remember anything about it. Can't really say anything about that. Again, don't know if they even exist anymore. Below that, though, we had Sunline Products. They had some of the best stuff at the time. They made a crossbar pad called the Debruiser, which I just loved. One of my all-time favorite designs. It's kind of rubber with an open cell design. It was really cool. In the days before people started running like Renthal crossbars and stuff, this was like the hot setup for sure. They also had the grips I used to love to run was their D grip, which was a kind of a half waffle design with a smooth top. It was a little thicker than a standard like Honda grip. Had a really nice compound. Didn't give me blisters. I love these grips. Now this grip here, the Grip Grip, never ran this one. This one's pretty weird. There was a lot of weird ideas about what was the best thing to do as far as giving you a good hand on the bar. Some even had like a hexagonal or like a pentagon design it was just weird. There was some weird stuff going on in the 70s and 80s with grips, and this is one of them. It's I don't think it ever caught on. They probably sold about 5 of these. Never saw anybody with them. On the right, we have an ad for DG Performance. They were really big in the 80s and even the late 70s with performance on ATVs and motocross too. Really, by the time this was around in the late 80s, they were more of an ATV focused brand. They did a lot of work on the souping up quads. You saw everybody with like a Blaster or somebody had one of these Type 2s on it. But they did do some motocross stuff. They sponsored some motocross stuff, but by then it wasn't nearly the high profile stuff they'd done in the 70s. I think DG's still around today. Pretty much you only see them on vintage bikes though. They're kind of like really a niche brand. You know, if you want a pipe for your CR480 or something, most guys run a DG. I had one on mine. They're kind of like that's their bailiwick. All right, page 18 and 19 and more ads. Motocross Action was killing it in 1989. They literally were like the only, almost the only game in town for some of these big ad buyers, and they would punish you if you actually advertised with somebody else. I know Access Sport was pretty much exclusively in Motocross Action, so you see a lot of their stuff in here. This ad for Ironworks Cycle, again, don't remember them. I don't know if they're still around. Apparently nobody beats their prices, but I'm not sure if that was good enough to stay in business. On the right here you have the mail entries. These are kind of hit or miss. Sometimes they be entertaining. A lot of times they just basically called the person writing an idiot. The Wiseco stuff here. Wiseco, I've used Wiseco pistons over the years. That's one of those things you hear good and bad about. Some people swear by them. Some people tell you they break all the time. In theory, I think they should be better. They're forged instead of cast, which a lot of the stock stuff is. I've definitely run them. Never had a problem with them. So they're still around. That tells you something. All right, now we have an ad for one of my all-time favorite motorcycles, and actually one of my favorite ads. This ad is for the 1990 Honda CR250R. For 1990, they went back to the Honda orange color they had used from 83 till 87. And you can see they put this dog in the kind of the same orangish color. And then the CR on the next page has got kind of the similar stance to it, and it talks about it being a whole new breed of animal, a whole new breed of CR. I love this bike. I had this, the 125 and the 500. I still love the looks of it. I think it's a great looking bike. I love the simplicity of it, particularly in contrast to like the later CRs where they got kind of tiger stripes on them in 91 and then they went all pink in 92. I hated that stuff at the time and just thought this 90 was a good looking motorcycle. I just did a kind of my top 10 picks, and I couldn't put this one up at the top. A lot of people don't care for the white on the frame. The 89, I will say, is probably a cleaner, better looking motorcycle, but this is a good looking bike for sure. It was a great motorcycle except for the forks. Forks were terrible in 90 on this thing. Good looking bike overall. I love the creativity of the ad. I really miss these creative ads. Everything's moved to the internet now, for better or worse, and there seems to be a little less creativity in terms of print media these days for obvious reasons, but definitely a great ad and one of my favorites of 90. All right, on page 24, we start a look at the motocross models for 1990. First up is Honda and Suzuki. As I said just a minute ago, the CR was definitely one of my favorite looking bikes that year, but maybe even better looking was the Suzuki, the RM. I love the 89 RMs. They were great. They were all new in 89. Great looking motorcycles after pretty much being the goofiest looking bike for several years. For 1990, they were even better. I like the kept the yellow and blue, the simple yellow and blue classic that Suzuki should never deviate from, in my opinion, and added a kind of an updated graphic that I prefer to the 89 look. Still, either one's good looking, but 90 is really my pick. The next page we get Kawasaki and Yamaha. Kawasaki was by far the most revolutionarily changed bike that year. It had an all new perimeter frame. It was new from stem to stern. Much improved motorcycle in a lot of ways. This first generation was a little bit big and bulky, but it was a very cool machine. Had a lot of power that year. It was one of those bikes that people loved or hated, probably because of the size and the way it ran. But there's no doubt it was the trickiest bike that year. Below you can see the Yamaha and its new kind of tank shroud combo. Not a real big difference. This bike, like I said, was probably the least visually interesting to me that year. Good motorcycle though, kind of a middle of the road bike. Couldn't go wrong with it, but it wasn't as kind of sexy as the Kawasaki. But if you're looking to have a really good bike that did everything well and nothing poorly, the Yamaha was a good way to go that year. On page 28 and 29, we get a ad for High Point Racing's new GP gloves, GP gear, and Series 2 gear. The ad stars Todd DeHoop, who was the East Coast 125 champion in 1988, and Jeff Pastana, which was a NorCal guy, rode some nationals. I don't believe he ever did that well on the national scene, but it was a guy you saw in magazines, probably mostly because of his looks. Definitely a good-looking fella. This gear itself, not amazing. I never had any high point stuff. You can see it kind of has that satiny look that Thor was going for, and Axo was at the time. It was really the hot look, was that kind of a Takasel satin look. Definitely was popular. These they weren't gel print. These printed graphic shirts were pretty sweet looking. I had an MSR one kind of similar to this, but never had this particular gear. Not a bad looking stuff. Kind of a weird. I'm not sure what the girl in the background's doing there. It's a little odd, but definitely a memorable ad anyway. On page 30, we get an ad for Cinesolo's GP gear. I like this stuff. I never had any Cinesolo stuff. Actually, I take that back. I did have a set of McGrath's Cinesolo stuff from '94, a couple years later than this. I didn't have it in the Jeff Ward era. Stuff was good. It was built in Finland, high quality stuff. I remember it being kind of expensive. Although when you look at what things cost now, it's kind of crazy that jerseys back then cost the same as they do now, when everything else has gone up 4 or 5 times. Good looking stuff. On the right here on page 31, we have a little more information on the 1990 Yamahas and an ad for Torque Center. I do remember Torque Center. I never ordered anything from them. Again, don't know if they're still around. If they aren't, rest in peace, Torque Center. If you are, good for you. On page 32, we have some more bike info, and we also have a couple of ads for companies that everybody probably has heard of. Troy Lee Designs, obviously still around, big today, running the KTM 250 factory effort. This one's got a Moto 5. A helmet I did not care for. A Moto 4 I loved. Moto 5 was uncomfortable. It was weird. Didn't like that helmet very much. Below that is a ad for AMP Research. They're the guys that did that weird fork we talked about earlier. They also did, as you can see, the AMP link here, which was a apparatus designed to release your rear suspension from the torque forces of the motor. The only bike I ever rode, I did ride an ATK 250 and 89 or 90 model. Buddy of mine was a distributor, and I got to ride that a couple of times. It was a weird motorcycle. I got to be honest, the rest of the bike was so strange it was hard to tell how much of that was the rear suspension. I know the magazines loved them, but like I said, I couldn't really tell if it was the suspension. I was more weirded out by the Rotax motor and the feel, and it was just a strange bike. On the next page, we have an ad for Bob's Cycle Supply. Now, this is a company that I do know is still around. They're still in business, and I did order a few things from them over the years. And yay for Bob's. I'm glad they're still around. On page 34, we get some more pictures of the 1990 motorcycles. One thing you will notice in these old magazines compared to today is how much of it is in black and white. Probably 3/4 or maybe even 80% of the magazine is actually not in color. And it might be 95% of the magazine if you take the ads out of the picture. These pictures of the bikes are fine and dandy back then, but now it sucks to see them in black and white. As a person who's always looking for really high color quality photos for my articles I write, it always bums me out when they show like an obscure model and it's black and white, because I really prefer to use color if I can find it. On the right here we have an ad for Rick Johnson, who was moving to JT Racing for '89. At the end of the '88 season, Honda had come to the great conclusion to kind of stick all of its riders in their TX10 gear, and Ricky wasn't really down with that. What ensued was like a little bit of a fight between Fox and Honda over the whole team rider stuff, and I don't know exactly what went down. I've heard some different versions of what happened from like Pete Fox versus Ricky and stuff, but long story short, RJ ended up going to JT Racing, kind of said screw both of y'all, and then went completely outside the box there. He had some pretty cool gear that year. This Bad Boys gear was pretty interesting. He also did like a Cyborg line the next year. I did not really care for that. Probably of his JT stuff, this is probably my favorite. This is pretty good looking stuff. JT Racing, even by '89, was kind of on a downward trend. Their heyday was the mid '80s. With Fox and Axo Sport kind of coming up, they were already kind of getting pushed out of the limelight a little bit. But this stuff in '89 was pretty good looking. Starting on page 36, we get a preview of the all-new 1990 KTM 250. KTM in '89 had hired Brock Glover, who had been let go by Yamaha, to ride the GPs and help develop this motorcycle. The hope was they'd come up with a motorcycle that would be more in line with the American taste. The KTM's always been pretty successful overseas in Europe. They'd won several world titles, but here in the U.S. they hadn't really caught on. Their bikes were very weird. They had 89. They still had things like left-hand kickstart and just were strange. The suspension settings weren't really to most people's likings here. The handling was much more geared towards high-speed stability than turning. Overall, they were just kind of strange. In '90, they came out with an all-new bike that was kind of patterned after the Honda CR250 in terms of the layout, the looks. Moved the Kickstarter to the right side. Was, I think, a really good-looking motorcycle. I love the looks of this thing. It turned out to be not the best motorcycle. It was kind of slow this year. The ergonomics and most of the other parts of it, though, were a big improvement over '89 as far as the American tastes were concerned. It was definitely a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, KTM was kind of really getting ready to go into the gutter. They would actually be bankrupt a couple years after this. They were having some hard times there, and they would end up splitting the company into a motorcycle division and then a division to handle all their other stuff. And over the next like 10, 15 years, they really kind of had a renaissance. And then in the 2000s, obviously, we know what happened where they kind of, now they're really on top. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. This was actually really kind of the low point here. Even though this was, I think, a great looking motorcycle, this bike didn't turn out to be the one that would turn them around. It would probably take another 15 years for that to happen. Here on page 38, we get Larry Brooks looking really, really dapper in pink for Thor Racing. I actually had this gear, this exact color combo and stuff. Really liked it. Good looking stuff. I wish I still had it. It was, again, that kind of satiny Takasel look. The Viking line was what it was called. Playing on, remember, Thor stands for Torsten Hallman Original Racewear, which was Torsten Hallman was a very famous Swedish racer in the 60s. He was the founder of Thor. A lot of people don't realize that now, but the Viking line was kind of a play on his Scandinavian roots there. Good looking gear, good looking ad. On page 39, we have MXA testing Brock's bike. They rode the prototype for the 90 KTM at Unadilla that year after the GP. They came away, mildly impressed. They thought it was better as far as the feel, but didn't really care for the power all that much. Brock talks about all the stuff they went through to kind of get the motor working. They had some issues to work through early in the season. In the early part of the GPs, they had some breakdowns and lack of parts. Apparently only had one cylinder and ended up breaking a swing arm because they couldn't get one that was built fast enough that was forged. They had a lot of teething problems that year. I think Brock did end up winning one round, if I remember right. But overall, it was mostly a kind of a year towards trying to develop this motorcycle more than win races. After the Glover piece, we get an introduction to Motocross Action's first Hall of Fame. This was a thing they did for a couple of years in the early 90s. This is the first one they did. They chose 4 riders this year for the first one. And picked a couple of motorcycles and then mentioned some kind of very important aftermarket equipment kind of things too. I was really surprised that they didn't keep going with this. I think part of the problem was they probably should have gone with maybe 1 or 2 a year. If you think about motocross in '89, if you think about how far back this was from now, the sport was basically 20 years old then in the U.S., maybe just under that. Very, very, almost like going back to the late 90s now, which seems like just yesterday to me, but pretty amazing. The sport wasn't that old, so there wasn't a whole lot of really great riders to choose from if you start, cranking them off 4 every year. It's not like football where you have, 50 players on every team going back till the history of forever. For Motocross Action, they kind of limited themselves to guys who had influence on America, and that kind of really limits you. You're talking about 20 years, and like I said, you start ticking off 4 years, you probably run out of them pretty quick. I guess they probably figured that out after 2 or 3 of these and stopped doing them. But this first one, I have to agree with most of the picks. They're all good choices. For their first selection, Motocross Action went with Roger DeCoster, who was a 5-time world motocross champion, a man who's they say is the greatest motocrosser of all time. I certainly think that was true in 1989. He would probably hold that easily. I don't know if you'd still say that today with guys like Ricky Carmichael and all the things he did. It's hard to say that DeCoster would hold the number 1 place still. But if you look at a guy who has had the most influence overall, if you count as a rider, as a team manager, overall influencer in the sport, DeCoster would definitely be number 1. He is still powerful and influential in the sport, even in its mid-70s now. DeCoster was a great rider on the track. I think a lot of guys now, even somebody my age, I'm almost 50, and I never saw him ride live. I haven't only seen a few videos of him, in fact, because the 70s there wasn't much footage. It's only few and far between. But it's hard to argue with all his many accomplishments, both in the sport and later after his retirement. For number two, MXA went with Brad Lackey, the first American to win a 500 World Motocross title. Technically, actually, the first guy to win a World Motocross title at all. He beat out Danny Laporte by about a week or so, I think, for that important distinction. Brad was a guy who was one of America's first motocross heroes. Won the 500 national title here in America in '72 before going to Europe and being our top guy over there for many years. Rode for teams like Factory Honda in its heyday, Kawasaki, and then eventually won the title for Suzuki. Also rode for Husqvarna here. You can see he rode for Husky in the around '75, '76 era, if I remember right. Brad was a guy who, after he won the title, he kind of faded away after that. I understand that he had burned some bridges. I think he could be a little difficult to work with at times, but there was no doubt that he was an amazing rider, and he's a great interview now. If you ever hear any of the podcasts Mathis has done with him, he has an amazing memory for stuff and is a great listen for sure. On page 48 here, we get an ad for Midwest Action Cycle. At the time, these guys were all over motocross action. You saw their ads all the time. I actually never ordered anything from them, but as you can see, they had a little bit of everything. I think they're still around too. They sell all kinds of brands and are still in business, which, again, yay, good for them. On page 50, we get Motocross Action's number 3 selection for their inaugural Hall of Fame, which is Gary Jones, who was America's first national motocross champion. Some of those titles are a little funny because in the early days, the AMA didn't count foreign-born riders. So even though in his first title, I don't believe Gary actually finished quote-unquote first in terms of points, but he was the first American, so that he was awarded the inaugural AMA title. That said, though, Gary was an amazing rider. He backed it up with several more titles, and winning them on different brands, too. He won a title on a Yamaha, Honda, and a Can-Am, even, the Canadian-built motorcycles. Definitely an amazing talent on a motorcycle. His dad was his mechanic, if I remember right, and his brother was pretty fast, too. Gary also has one of the interesting distinctions of being like one of the only riders to ever own his own motorcycle company. In the mid-'70s, he started a company called Jones Amex. I believe the bikes were built in Mexico, which probably wasn't a great indicator at the time. They didn't really do very well. I think Mexico ended up getting caught up with some tax nonsense or something with tariffs, and it ended up sinking them. But anyways, he did own his own motorcycle company for a while. Gary is also well known as a test rider for MX Action for many years. So he may still ride for him. I'm not sure. I imagine he's probably up there in years now. But definitely a talented guy and worthy of being on the Hall of Fame for sure. All right, now we have one of my favorite ads of the early '90s. The ad for the all-new and completely redesigned 1990 Kawasaki KX250. Terrible puns aside, I thought this was a great ad. It doesn't really, I got to be honest, if you look at the ad, it's really just a picture of the motorcycle. There's nothing really spectacularly creative about it. The lighting is good, the picture's good. It's really nice. I love when they do showcase the motorcycle, much like that Honda one earlier, where you get a good look of it. Personally, like I love taking these pictures out and putting them on my wall. I wallpapered my bedroom with stuff like this. So this motorcycle ad is definitely near and dear to my heart. This motorcycle, I never had one. My best friend has one now. He's restoring it. I know Mathis did one a couple years ago. I have ridden it several times, though. It was a kind of a large, big, bulky motorcycle for its time, but so trick. This thing was so space age and so cool, and very much like the '97 CR. Kind of made people's jaws drop at the time when they saw it. It was just such a departure from the kind of stodgy, big, and ponderous '89 model. I don't know if probably wasn't actually that much of a better motorcycle. The '89 was a pretty good bike, but in terms of trickness, this was definitely a whole new ball game for Kawasaki. Love this ad. Definitely one of my favorites. On page 54, we get Motocross Action's 4th pick for their inaugural Hall of Fame, Marty Smith. Marty was one of America's first motocross heroes. He was the first AMA 125 national champion in 1974, and he backed it up the next year in '75 with another title. In '76, he actually did an amazing thing. He tried to ride the Nationals and the World title, World Championship GPs, finishing second in the Nationals and third overseas. Pretty amazing when you think about flying back and forth and trying to do both series. Marty did win a 500 title as well. Might have won more, but he ended up hurting himself in the late '70s pretty badly. I think he separated his hip, if I remember right, but he did something that kind of detuned him a little bit after that. I think he said in some interviews at the time it was, or a little bit after his retirement, that the injury definitely impacted his riding. He wasn't really willing to push it as much after that. Marty was a good-looking guy, definitely popular with the fans. Went on to do a motocross school after his retirement. One of the first guys kind of to do that. Him and Tony D and some of the early '70s guys made a name for themselves in the '80s doing motocross schools. So Marty definitely one of the icons of the sport, and I definitely endorse this pick. On page 56 and 57, Motocross Action goes over some of the riders that didn't make the cut this year. Again, as I said earlier, I think maybe they probably should have only gone with one or two because even at this point, there's not a ton of guys if you start rattling off four a year. Certainly guys like Torsten Hallman would definitely probably qualify. Although it is interesting to me, you see some guys like Harry Everts and some of the other guys from Europe that they laid down importance to American motocross, and I'm not so sure that some of these guys were that influential. Some guys obviously came over and rode the Trans Am A's. Guys like Torsten Hallman, very influential, but some of the others probably not. Gaston Rainier and some of these other dudes I wouldn't think would make the cut as far as American motocross goes. If they had limited a little bit, they probably could have kept it going longer than a couple of years. On page 58, we get a couple of motorcycles that they picked to put in the Hall of Fame. The first one is the original 1973/74 CR125 M. This was the first kind of competitive 125 from Japan. Definitely an important motorcycle. The second one is a Hodaka Super Rat. I got to be honest, I grew up riding in the '80s. I never rode a Hodaka. Didn't know anybody who had a Hodaka. If you read some of the stuff they write about here, how I guess how popular they were. I do know they were inexpensive and they always had weird names, but I don't know much about them in terms of their actual performance or anything. So I'll have to go on Jody's pick here because I don't have much to say. Sunshine Cycle. I hope you're still around. Good luck with that. On page 60, they added a couple of tracks. This is another thing I don't really remember them doing. I know they did the Rider of the Year for a couple more years, but I don't remember them adding more tracks. This is another thing you'd think you'd run out of pretty quick if you're talking about tracks that are no longer around. But Peppernell is a track I know absolutely zero about. Saddleback, of course, is iconic. Never got to watch anybody ride there, but I've certainly read and heard about the million stories from the place and seen the Massacre at Saddleback video they came out with a couple years ago. Iconic track, some amazing jumps there. I could definitely see putting these on, or at least Saddleback. Like I said, Peppernell, I know nothing about it. Tri-Pro Racing, I think you're gone. Rest in peace. On page 62, Motocross Action talks about some more significant items. I'm not sure if they're actually talking about putting them in the Hall of Fame. It's not clear to me here. I don't remember them doing a Hall of Fame for accessories, but maybe they did. But anyways, like the full bore boots, they were like one of the first motocross boots, specifically designed for that. Bell's original MotoStar helmet, one of the first full face helmets. The Jaffa mouth guard, and of course, like the Monoshock. All of those are pretty iconic items from the '70s. On the right here, you have a great ad for JT Racing's Dalmatian gear. This is some really cool stuff. Never had this particular stuff, but it looked good with Ronnie Lachine here. His nickname was the Dogger. Kind of tied in nicely here with this ad. Definitely some cool stuff. One of the last really great kind of designs that JT did kind of before it went in the tank, in my opinion. Starting on page 64, we get some coverage of the 1989 US GP from Unadilla in New York. This was a really interesting race for a lot of reasons. For a lot of people, this was the first race they were going to see Rick Johnson coming back from his wrist injury that I'd spoken about earlier. And a lot of people wanted to see, could he come back? Whether it was going to be, I don't think any of us thought it was going to be a career ender because it wasn't the same kind of coverage you get now. You didn't really know how bad it was. Just it was totally dislocated and just what a gruesome injury it was. But Ricky was coming back. He had went to out here and dominated the race more or less. He kind of stalked Jean-Michel Bayle, who was the guy winning the 250 world title that year, and kind of passed him and checked out. He looked like the same old guy. I think I know when I was reading this stuff, I was like, oh my God, Ricky was my guy, and I was so pumped to see him come back. I thought he was going to come back and you know kick Jeff Stanton's ass and uh, teach him who was boss. But unfortunately, that didn't didn't go that way. This race was also well known for being Bob Hanna's last race. He was kind of retiring after this. He had been riding a race or two every year, not many, usually Unadilla or Southwick or something he really liked, and he picked this race to be his kind of his swan song. And he was always a real popular rider at Unadilla. Don't think he had a great day. I don't remember how his finishes were, but it wasn't like he went out and won or anything. But this was his last hurrah. This race is also interesting to me for the support class. This is a race I've never seen, and I wish I could have. Had Jeff Stanton in it. I wish the heck I had had a chance to see him on a 125. Apparently, he just was hauling ass that day. I know my buddy Mike Sweeney was there, and he said it was amazing to watch, and he just was pinned on that thing. And I would love to see some video of it. It kind of sucks because a lot of these GPs, there are video of them, but this one I've never seen any kind of video from it at all. Nothing from Sports Center or Motor World or anything, and I would definitely love to see the race. So if anybody has it out there, let me know. I'd definitely like to check it out. On the left here, we have an ad for the Roost Boost, which was a gimmicky item that I actually bought. Answer Racing had sold it. I bought one for my 87 CR125. I noticed absolutely zero difference. I think it's kind of a gimmick. Over the years, they've done a lot of these things. I think one was called the iCat, and I got to be honest, in these early days of electronics, I don't think it made a bit of a difference. It's not like plugging a program in today. Kind of a gimmicky thing that I always thought was a bunch of BS. I felt bad about buying it after I bought it. Next up, we have an ad for some back issues of Motocross Action. These are great magazines this era. If you don't have some, they're well worth picking up on eBay or something. I have all of them. Maybe if everybody likes this enough, we'll do some more of them. On the right, we have an ad for Pro Circuit. Great picture of Ricky Johnson from the 87. No, it looks like 88 season. Looks like it's Brock Glover behind him and Mike Fisher as well. Ricky was one of the first guys to kind of run a pro circuit pipe on the Nationals that I can remember. And I know in '86 he preferred the pro circuit pipe to the factory Honda one. It had a little smoother power, more bottom end, and ran it in Supercross. And that's kind of one of the really big breakthroughs that Mitch's team had to have it on his bike. So he was always highlighted in a lot of their ads at the time. After that, we get an ad for O'Neill's casual wear for '89. I do miss that a little bit. It seems like I'm sure there's probably actually more shirts out there now, more stuff. You can get stuff done custom now. But in the late '80s, there was a lot of cool shirts that people like O'Neill and Fox and all these guys had. You could buy Access Sport. This is some pretty cool stuff. I don't think I actually had any of these, but I definitely bought plenty of them over the years. I really like that Scott stuff to the lower right, the cool goggle one, and definitely some cool stuff. If you were in the market for some T-shirts back then, it was a good choice to go with some O'Neill stuff. Next up, we have the second comeback story of the issue. This one again involves Rick Johnson, and it's from the 22nd annual Mammoth Mountain Motocross. I remember hearing about this at the time, and guys talking about how RJ was going to just come back and kick everybody's butt. He went out there at Mammoth Mountain and won all three classes, if I remember right. He won the 125s, 250, and 500 class, and looked great on the bike doing it. They talked to him a little bit about it, and he said his wrist was sore, but again, I don't think he had any idea it was going to cause so many problems for him. I think it was obviously Supercross was probably harder on it because it would lock up on him and it was harder for him to control it. Maybe a little easier outdoors. You got a little more room. You have to be quite so precise outdoors. Still pretty scary if your wrist locks up though. I was a huge RJ fan and I was so pumped to see him come out there and kick butt. And then I went to the Budds Creek National that year. He was on a 500 and he promptly went out and just knocked the crap out of himself over the Big Gulp, which was the big uphill double. And it was just like, oh man, what's going on with this? Just kind of a downward spiral after that. It's sad, but this Mammoth Mountain event and the USGP that year were kind of like the highlight that of that year, and kind of got your hopes up for a comeback that was never going to happen. It really is a bummer. He did win a couple of more rounds. I think he won one 500 national and one 250 national after '89, but it wasn't anything like where it was before the wrist injury. It's such a bummer way to end his career. After RJ kicking butt at Mammoth Mountain, we get a look back at the 125 Supercross Series Roundup from 1989. That year it was a runaway out west and a tight battle in the east. Out west it was Jeff Matasevich dominating the entire series. He had done it 2 years in a row, smoked everybody in '88 as well, if I remember right. He was really, really dominant that year. Not so much outdoors, but in the Supercross series, he was really good. Uh, in the East, it was Damon Bradshaw and Mike Kudrowski who were going at it, and the champion ended up being Damon Bradshaw. Amazingly, this was the only title that Bradshaw would ever win. It's hard to fathom that now, but he definitely seemed like he left a lot on the table there. Behind the three highest profile riders, we had a lot of other big names in this series in '89. Guys like Denny Stevenson, Ty Davis, Mike LaRocco, even a very young Jeremy McGrath was in that title fight. Jeremy actually ended up getting a second place at Seattle that year, kind of out of nowhere. He'd been in the intermediates before that, and that kind of gave him a support ride for the next year. He rode for Team Green in '90 with Kawasaki, and would end up winning the Las Vegas round that year. Jeff Emig was also in this battle. It was definitely a who's who were going to be dominating the sport and being up front in the next few years in the early '90s. After the wrap up, we get a little interview with the three champs. Mike Kudrowski did lose that East Coast title to Bradshaw. We did get a little bit of some satisfaction by winning the East West Shootout that year. Matasevich, like I said, had dominated his crown. Looked like he was destined to be a future champion. Almost pulled it off the next year in '90, but kind of choked at the end. And of course, Bradshaw. Oh, Bradshaw. I was always a huge Damon Bradshaw fan. He was so fun to watch, but kind of sucked how things went. He could have won the outdoor title that year in '89 too. He was really fast outdoors, but again, same old Bradshaw. He'd throw it away and get a DNF and cartwheel his bike or some crap had happened, and it kept him from ever kind of reaching his full potential. Kind of the story of his career. On the next page, we get a Oakley Blades ad. I wear prescription glasses. Always super bummed out that I could not wear Oakleys. I wanted a pair of these Blades so bad, but instead I wore like some, goofy standard glasses. Still to this day, kind of kills me that I can't wear a pair of these. I wish I could. I'd be like Matheson, rock them even now. On the next page, we have an ad to subscribe to Motocross Action. I have been a constant subscriber to Motocross Action since like about 1985. Still subscribe now, although I do it digitally, read it on my iPad. I ran out of space. As you can see in the opening video, I have cabinets or bookcases full of magazines here, and I kind of just got tired of sticking them on bookshelves. One nice thing to notice is you can get a magazine subscription now for, I think it's like $15, and you can look at in 1989 it was $11. So it's pretty amazing that they prices haven't gone up. Actually, $12, $11.98. Counted for inflation is pretty amazing. That's a pretty good deal these days. After the 125 Supercross Roundup, we get one for the 250 Outdoors. This one was a series dominated by Jeff Stanton. After Rick Johnson was injured at round one in practice, the first round was actually won by Jean-Michel Bayle, who was on a pro circuit privateer Honda. Kind of came over here and kicked everybody's butt, surprisingly. But after that, Jeff took command of the series and won every round but the last one. The last round was at Troy, was run by Ron Lachine. Other than that, Jeff won every round and won the series easily. Behind him, you had Jeff Ward in second, who was consistent but didn't win any overalls. And then tied for third was Ron Lachine and Ronnie Titchener, who was on a factory Suzuki. Another guy that a lot of people thought would be a big superstar, and he just kind of fizzled out here in the U.S. Although he did go to Japan and get some titles there. In fifth, you had Sean Kalos, and then in sixth, you had Doug Dubach, another guy with an incredible long career, still going fast now. After that, we have a ad for Dennis Kirk, who I believe is still around as well. That was definitely one of the bigger ones, bigger mail order companies at the time. I used to get the Dennis Kirk catalog and thumb through it, and I believe they're still around today. After the Dennis Kirk ad, we have one for one of the other mail order powerhouses of its time, Chaparral. Today, Chaparral, probably remembered by most people as being a sponsor of Jeremy McGrath during his Supercross winning years. They were one of his major sponsors in those years when he was on a Yamaha. But Chaparral was one of the pioneers with the motocross catalogs in the 80s. I used to get the catalog. I still have some of them here. Maybe we'll go over one of them one time. But there's a lot of great stuff in there. They had pretty much anything you wanted. I always wanted to actually go out there. I believe they have a huge dealership out in California. I've never been, but I always wanted to go there and see all this stuff in person. Here in Virginia, You really didn't. The dealers didn't carry a lot of off-road accessory stuff, so a lot of the stuff you'd only see in the catalogs. And Chaparral had just everything. It was awesome. Their ads, though, left a lot to be desired. These models, I always wondered if they were like relatives of the people who own the place. I mean, the guys could not be more pasty. They just look goofy. The girl who was doing the ad here has some really big '80s hair. God bless her. They also choose to highlight like not top line gear. You don't see them like in AXO and stuff. A lot of times you see them like in Ocelot or USA or some kind of inexpensive stuff. I suppose that allowed them to advertise a low price. And like I said, it's pretty remarkable how gear now kind of costs the same as it did then. It's really amazing. I mean, some of this low end stuff, maybe not so much. You probably still could get a boot for $100 from somebody if it's a low end one. But the fact that adjusted for inflation, gear should cost about 4 or 5 times what it did back then, but it doesn't. That probably has more to do with where it's built than anything. Like I said, Chaparral was awesome at the time, and if you were in moto at this time, I'm sure you definitely had a Chaparral catalog just like I did. All right, we're into the home stretch now, so I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the stuff here at the back. The first one is this ad for Kraus Racing, the same company that did Sidewinder, sprockets. They also did pipes. The thing that was cool about these was they came in colors. Actually, maybe I shouldn't say cool. It was unique. Maybe not cool. They could get them in gold and red and white and all kinds of nutty stuff. I never actually had any, but it was definitely something to set it apart. There was an ad that did have the color, but unfortunately this issue of Motocross Action doesn't have it. On page 102, we get an ad for High Flight's seats. These are always, to me, kind of a cheesier version of seat racing stuff, which was the other kind of major competitor for aftermarket seats. At the time, there weren't the high-quality OEM-style replicas you could get now. Basically, you went with seat or High Flight. High Flight was weird in that it seems like every ad showed like a high-rise seat, and I'm not sure if you couldn't get one in the standard height, but that was like their niche. I don't know, but at the time, it seemed like all the ads showed were these really tall ones. Race Tech, of course, I still use Race Tech on my stuff. I had them do both the suspension on my Project 90 when I had my CR 250 a couple years ago, and I had them redo my 2016 KTM 250, and they did a phenomenal job with it. If you need some suspension work, see Race Tech. I don't have too much to say about the showcase section here, other than this was kind of like the eBay of its day. Back in the 80s, even in the 90s, you couldn't just find some random part for your motorcycle and search for it on eBay or some other, some website in Europe or something. You kind of went back here to the showcase section and you tried to look up some obscure junkyard or something that was advertising the part you needed. So I don't even know if it still exists, to be honest, in the new magazine. I don't know, but at the time this was kind of a handy resource. On the next page we have ads for Maxima, which is still around. That's Ronnie Lachine's dad started that company, and I think Ronnie's running it now. Excellent oil, always used it myself. No Lean, still around, yay. Body Fuel, no idea. Scott's, I gotta be honest, I don't know if Scott's suspension stuff is still around at all. One of my favorite articles, though, even in the current MXA, I do still read Motocross Action, is the Ask the MXperts. I still read that every month, and sometimes there's some good information in there. Here is also an ad for Seat Racing, which was the competitor to High Flight. Obviously, this was some really cool stuff at the time. Zebra print, tiger stripes, whatever, was real popular in the late 80s, and this was some cool stuff. I had my buddy had the red one here on his XR. I always wanted one. I never had anything other than a plain one, though. I never got one of the safari seats, but I always thought they were cool. Would look cool on my bike. One of those things that got to check off the bucket list to get one. I can't say I enjoyed the stuff here on page 108 and 109. It's all a bunch of cool sunglasses that I can't wear because I have to wear prescription glasses. There's a really cool set of those Rosas, which were kind of like paint splattered. They did a version of Scott goggles as well. I don't know what happened to the Jim Rosa, if he's still doing stuff, but in '89 he had some motocross themed stuff. JT had their threads. You had frog skins and Oakley razor blades, and there's all kinds of cool glasses that I couldn't wear. And yes, I'm still bitter about it 30 years later. The only thing of note I have to say about the ads on page 110 and 111 is the one for the Budds Creek Pro National that year in October. That was the first one I went to there. It was the first like real pro race I'd ever been to. I'd never been to a national before. I'd really never seen a track like Budds Creek. I'd ridden a couple of tracks at this point. I rode over in Antietam, which was over in Hagerstown, Maryland, White Oak, and some other tracks. But I'd never seen anything quite as impressive as Budds Creek. It really was like blew my mind when I went to the race that year. And it's interesting to see how late in the year it is. It was in October. Back then, you'd go there and you'd wear a sweatshirt, and it was a beautiful time of year. I loved motocross in the fall. It kind of sucks that they don't do that anymore. But the race, the race schedule was much different back then. '89 was a great year, and one of the most memorable experiences I've had in my life was going to that first national. Our great moments section here actually covers Barry Higgins, who apparently was America's first factory rider, which I had no idea that was the case. He got a ride with the OSA factory and rode for Yankee, which is a small little motocross machine I've never actually seen. I have heard of them, but in any case, interesting little tidbit of history. There's a cool Cinesalo gear ad. Like I said, I never had this version of Cinesalo stuff. Didn't really like the one with the flags and stuff on the back that much. It was okay, but overall, this was some clean gear, and Jeff Ward looked good in it. All right, we're rounding third and heading home here. We have, to round things out, we have a ad for Axo Sports lovely 125 ST pants for 1989. Love these pants. I didn't have this particular one. I had the 92 version. I always thought these were great looking. I love the logo. I did a whole thing on the history of Axo Sport if you want to see that. I plan on doing a video actually too, kind of like what I did for Fox as well at some point. Axo Sport was definitely kind of coming into its own at this point. JT was getting ready to go on the downward spiral, and Axo Sport was really asserting itself up there with Fox Racing as kind of the leaders in the sport, and this was some good looking stuff. On the last page, the back page of the magazine here, we have an ad for Answers Aluminite bars, which were some of the first really popular aluminum bars in the business. These at the time were the strongest bars you could buy. This was their high-end thing before they came out with the Pro Tapers about a year and a half later than this. These Aluminites, I had them. They were really tough, really great bars, and I think a lot of people had them. All the factory guys ran them at the time. They were really, really good stuff. Well, we've reached the end. This is the last page of this issue of Motocross Action. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've stayed with us, it's been almost an hour, and if you stayed to the end, I really appreciate it. If you do like it, let me know. This thing is pretty time consuming, but I like looking back at this stuff. I've read all these magazines 100 times. I look at them even now just for fun. I'll pull them out and kind of go through them again when I'm working on an article and read some of the stuff. It's kind of cool to look back at the history of the sport and looking at the ads and things that have kind of defined our sport over the years is kind of adds color to that. So like I said, if you enjoyed it, let me know, and I will try and do some more of these. If you have any particular requests, feel free to put them in the comments below or hit me up on Twitter. My handle is at Tony Blazer, TonyBlazier, and I'll be happy to add them to the queue for something to do in the future. Again, hope everybody enjoyed it, and peace.